Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, going back over 60,000 years, present and emerging. We have so much to learn about connection and respect from our Indigenous forefathers. Well, today we are welcoming back Helena Norberg-Hodge. Now, Helena is a globally respected analyst of the global economy's impact on communities, local economies, and personal identity around the world. Helena founded Local Futures in 1978. And Local Futures is a pioneer of the world localization movement, raising awareness about the power of going local as a key strategy for restoring ecological, social, and spiritual well-being. Helena is also the author of Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh, and Local is Our Future. She's also a producer of the documentary The Economics of Happiness. She's the recipient of many awards, including the Right Livelihood Award, also known as the Alternate Nobel Prize, the Goya Peace Prize for her pioneering work towards a new economy, and the Arthur Morgan Award, which honours those who are passionate about and committed to community, democracy, entrepreneurship, and individual character. Well, Helena is definitely committed and passionate and articulate and, in my opinion, convincing. And I'm sure you will agree too. It's such a pleasure to welcome back Helena to my podcast. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Helena Norberg-Hodge. Welcome back, Helena.
Thank you. Very glad to be here.
Helena, it's always good to have you on, and I always think people cannot hear this message often enough. We're going to talk about localization, of course, but I wondered if we might just take a step back from that, because the vast majority of perhaps our listeners, although I know you and I both remember a different time, but the vast majority of our listeners have grown up in a globalized world, which kind of is easy to think, this is normal, this is the world. Can we just reflect on what a globalized world is?
Yes. And I want to also explain that I've lived in so many different countries. So I've experienced an unglobalized world in my native country of Sweden, in America, in Germany, in France, and in these remote cultures of Ladakh and Bhutan, the Tibetan cultures. Basically, in the modern world, in Sweden and in America, people had much more time. People did not have to work as hard to pay the rent or the mortgage or put food on the table. In fact, in the earlier period before globalization took off, which was in the sort of late 80s, people, the average family, only the father worked. And then what happened is, as prices went up, women had to join the workplace. And even then, both the mother and father were working even harder and running faster. An interesting part of this was also that communication moved more slowly. Everyone used the post office, and the post office was the same price for everyone, whether you were poor or whether you were a CEO of a big company. It operated at the same speed. So you didn't have some advantage as you do now, being an Amazon that can fly things all around the world at an artificially low price. And if you and I want to post a book to another country, it costs more than the price of the book. Another thing that was part of the reality is that if you were a sports star or if you were a musician, you were actually playing to an audience that was deeply appreciative, sometimes many thousands of people, but you weren't on a stage of 8 billion people competing with about 1 billion people. So if you were a football player, you were known in England, if you were part of Manchester United, you came from Manchester. If you were playing in an orchestra or a singer, you were well known in your country, but you weren't necessarily known globally. But what it meant was that there were many, many more stars. There were many, many more sports players who were getting a good livelihood and enjoying their work. Whereas now what we're seeing is this intense competition on everybody to compete to get into that echelon where you get paid $1 million for singing on, one show. Now, that sounds great, and many people have the ambition to do that. But the fact is that in the pre-global world, many more people had a chance to do many more things because they didn't have to devote so much time to just putting food on the table and a roof over their head. They were also able to have more time for sports, for music, for art, for each other, for themselves, for exercise. So I guess I would say the biggest take-home message is that globalization has made us poorer, and I mean financially poorer, but also time poor. And the time poverty is the clearest indicator of how impoverished we are. And the running faster and faster just to put that roof over our head and the food on the table it's killing us. And now on top of that, what we're seeing is a very clear trend that with globalization, not only are you running faster and faster, but you are more and more lonely. This is something that I became aware of already in the 70s in Sweden. People were isolated as part of modernity, moving into the cities becoming bigger and bigger, people living alone. And this has been exacerbated massively in the last 30, 40 years. So we have epidemics of depression in virtually every country. But because we don't get to hear the global picture, we often blame our own culture, our left or right government. People can blame everything in England on Maggie Thatcher or now on the more recent conservatives, but they really need to look at the big picture to see that Tony Blair and that both left and right have actually been supporting global corporations, globalization at the expense of their own country. And it's not a right or left issue. But I guess, the most important take-home message ultimately is that we were happier and healthier pre-globalization.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean it was perfect. We need to go back much further to more indigenous cultures, more balanced cultures where women and the feminine had a stronger voice, where spirituality was linked to deep ecological connections, to find something that can really be a signpost for where we want to go in the future. And that's what localization is for me. It's learning from indigenous culture where the community fabric was strong, where we also had a deep relationship with the natural world around us. And we were a lot happier and healthier.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to hear you say about Indigenous, because I start every podcast over the last year or two with an acknowledgement to country. And it's not lip service. It's because I truly believe we have a lot to learn from our Indigenous people about connection with people and planet. And I agree with that. It's so interesting too, because I remember a time when we all used to we owned the banks in Australia, we owned the telecommunications, the public service, the transport, the utilities, and then everything was privatized for efficiency. And anybody that's been on a phone call with these so-called efficient organizations know that's not true anymore. But then the interesting part was we were given credit to go and buy back shares in something we already owned. And if that's not an example of economic irrationalism, I mean, that is part of the problem, isn't it? The economic rationalism, the neoliberal model, cutting the legs out from underneath the labor force in Western countries.
Yes. I see also the neoliberal is so clearly mad, but from my point of view, learning from indigenous culture, we even have to define, talk about the liberal, if you like, before the neoliberal, meaning that the foundation of the modern economy was the idea that it is not in your interest to be a more self-reliant region or country. It's in your interest to specialize all of your production for export. So this system really started through creating debt and a loss of self-reliance, and with it a loss of self-esteem around the world. I mean, the precursor to the modern economy was the enclosures, slavery, genocide, with that, misogyny, massive misogyny. Christianity had built up before that to this quite frightening hatred of the feminine, of nature, burning women at the stake. Now, that's the foundation of the modern economy. So when the thinking comes in based on comparative advantage, saying that, oh, no, it's not in your interest in Australia or Scotland or anywhere to produce a range of things for your needs as a priority. No, you should shift away and produce for export. So, of course, that started with tea and cotton and mining and, so-called third world countries. But even in England, the enclosures meant that people were driven away from their land into impoverished London. And that was a mess, filthy, polluted, illness, crime. And if you stole a bit of old bread, you could be shipped off to Australia just like a slave. And now you are forced to, rob that country of its resources for Britain in huge monocultural plantations, sheep stations, all of this for export. So deeply in the economy has been this commitment to produce for export. Well, what does that mean? It means produce to make global traders richer. So in the modern era, it took on a new force after the Second World War with the Bretton Woods, IMF, World Bank, and the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And this was now countries committed to ensuring that every country would be subjected to so-called free trade, which meant that they had to open their doors to the Coca-Colas, the Monsantos, Monsanto wasn't around then, but to these giant banks and corporations. And if they didn't open their doors, they'd be punished in various ways. And all of this led to a type of colonialism through debt. And we often think about that in terms of the third world, but we don't realize that the US has the biggest debt of all, that the leaders of our modern industrial countries have also blindly supported global trade as a religion. And I'm monologuing so much now, but I just want us to talk also about what's happening right now in the UK because of what happened to the post office. And so I don't know if you've heard of this.
No, tell me.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting, and I really feel it's preparing the ground for this very important message about the need to move away from globalization towards localization, meaning, supporting local, regional, and national economies everywhere as a priority, and of course having trade where it makes sense for the majority, not just for the billionaires who are making more billions as we speak. We've just seen right now with Davos happening, we've seen statistics from Oxfam about how billionaires around the world have increased their wealth just in the last year. And the honest statistics that we need to really understand is that the middle class and of course the poor everywhere are getting poorer and poorer very rapidly. So in England, what started in the late 90s is that the post office brought in a new computer system from Japan. It was made by Fujitsu, a Japanese company. And that computer system had huge errors. And it led to the post office accusing people of embezzling funds. People were accused of embezzling between £1,000 and £100,000. Thousands of people. These were postmasters who were in small villages or bigger towns. You know, the post office had become a sort of a little window in a shop. Very often pillars of society, very respected. And now suddenly they were accused of stealing, and they were told, people from the post office came out and told them, you're the only one this is happening to. Nobody else has this problem. And no one else can go into your computerized account system. No one else. It's just you, no one else complaining. And the people who were sent out from the post office to tell people this got a bonus when they managed to prosecute people. And they were going around the country and telling thousands of people this. And then in the meanwhile, it turns out that Tony Blair was warning the post office about putting a bad image to this computer system because it would affect trade with Japan. So the post office was being encouraged to cover up and to pretend that this computer system was fine. They imprisoned people. People lost their houses. They lost their reputation. There were suicides, at least 4. And wonderfully, this is now all over the media in England, and it's all over the media for weeks because they made a docudrama. And in this docudrama, there are good actors who spell out what happened. And by the way, the wonderful, situation that brought tears to my eyes is when finally some of these people connect with each other and know that they're not alone, and they start collaborating to build up the momentum to take this on. So this is one of the key messages today. We need to try to connect with like-minded people. And that's over many issues. It's over our daughter's anorexia or over the other problems we might be facing. It's over, coming together to see how can we do something about changing the world for our own benefit and for the benefit of the planet. And that's what localization offers, is a systemic direction that we can all support.
Well, that's an incredible example of it, and I know this is something that you have been working with and on for over 40 years, and it's actually been interesting because over that time I've also been very aware of the role of the chemical, food, and pharmaceutical industry in healthcare, to which I would now add the media companies. And that's something that I have been aware of. I know you have been aware of, but we've just come out of a 2 or 3 year pandemic. And even having been aware of that, I was totally shocked by the level of influence. It even surprised me. How did you feel?
Yes, no, I absolutely didn't expect such an amazing handover of wealth and power to the pharmaceutical industry by our governments. But on the other hand, I had been studying this process whereby they were signing on to treaties, giving global corporations more and more power. And of course, one of the most important of all of those is also handing over the power to banks to create money out of thin air. So we've got this world now where there's like an empire of global corporations and banks that are operating as a globalized empire, dictating rules to our different governments. And we need to understand that, we need to spell it out. And we need also to realize that very often the people working in those banks and corporations are not aware of the bigger picture. They're not evil people who are consciously trying to harm us. But as part of that system, what had happened is that in medicine as well as the media, less and less accountability, less and less responsibility. In science, for instance, I had worked with many scientists who had seen how the regulations that were protecting both environmental health and human health were being removed at the time when the technologies were becoming more and more dramatic. You know, with genetic engineering, the ability to affect life on Earth for virtually infinitely, and the period from so-called discovery and market application was shrinking. And then we discovered also that the agencies that were meant to be protecting our health and the environmental health were more and more funded and basically run by the same businesses they were meant to be regulating. So it was still totally shocking to see what happened in the whole COVID situation. And again, I do want to remind people to try to remain compassionate and try to really understand how it was possible for doctors, politicians, people in power, people in the media to keep to a line that they should have questioned, to just, as it were, take orders from above and to believe that, you know, the World Health Organization must know what they're talking about. There should have been more questioning for sure. But I think from my experience in talking to ministers, to economists, to scientists, it's very clear that once you're in a culture within the power institutions, when you get up to a higher level, you're surrounded by assumptions that essentially say we've got to go in the same direction we've been going. And if we rock the boat, there will be more harm. I mean, it's particularly true. You see, the finance is leading it. And with the finance, the idea is that it's like a bicycle. And if we were to slow it down, if we were to, for instance, regulate the banks, governments would be so poor, there would be millions of people suffering. Now, that is absolutely not true. The truth is that by continuing to hand over power and make fewer and fewer billionaires even richer, they are impoverishing the majority. So changing that would actually be relatively easy. It would have much smaller social repercussions. It would be economically healing for society. But so when we understand that within the economic context, it's also easier to understand how within the pharmaceutical industry, within the World Health Organization, that things have shifted to be more about profit than about genuine health, that the time it takes to do proper research has shrunk. And here we were thrown into this mix that was disastrous. And we can just pray that there is more and more of a wake up, and that will show that we need more caution, we need more testing, we need to really know that what's happening is in the interest of health, not in the interest of profit.
No, I really, I mean, I agree with so much of what you say, but I agree with particularly that we shouldn't judge people harshly, because I believe the vast majority of people in public places and in doctors and politicians, they want the best. They have unwittingly, I think there are two or three words that summarize it for me in terms of understanding. One is business model. That goes a long way to explaining a great deal of what goes on in our world. But the second one that facilitates the business model with well-meaning people is overwhelm. Because I often hear doctors say, oh, there's no evidence to support this or that. Whereas I know to keep up with the evidence requires about 600 hours of reading a week. And I don't think there aren't 600 hours a week. So this is overwhelm, and this must be true to politicians, to all sorts of people in all sorts of positions.
Absolutely overwhelmed. And again, remember, we've seen this speeding up for everyone. We're seeing doctors, teachers, people before the pandemic having burnout. A lot of the younger people also just couldn't even finish with their medical studies. It's so intensely competitive. So again, part of this globalizing system has so increased competition. and time pressure. It's killing people.
Mm.
It's madness. And it all goes back to the economic trajectory of pushing everyone into this one globalized system, which cannot pay attention to the needs of people and nature, cannot respect diversity, the uniqueness of every individual, the uniqueness of every plant, every bit of soil. So also what I've been seeing over these years is that people in power operating within a worldview of numbers, of representations. They're not dealing with the actual people. They are dealing with very narrow assumptions that support continuing in the same direction that is deemed efficient, is deemed to be the only way to save lives or the only way to plant trees, planting vast monocultures that are deadly, that destroy the soil, destroy the ecosystem. So, yeah, I think we need to go back to the fundamentals, which have to do with what's happened to knowledge linked to economic growth. And that in turn has been linked to technology. And that's where you and I might differ, because recently when we spoke on the phone, you were more favorable about AI than I can be. I can't be, because I feel that the basic parameters are so dangerous. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think it has great potential, but unfortunately, it will be out of control. And if it comes into the hands of those that may not have our best interests in mind, and what are the chances of that happening? Well, quite high, I think. I am concerned. I mean, I see great potential, but then I saw great potential in the pandemic too. I thought this was a great opportunity to focus on public health. We were told if you were unhealthy, you were more susceptible to die in a week or 2 or 3 if you contracted the illness. So what a great motivation for public health. We didn't hear a thing about it.
Nothing. And that too, I really feel those who are talking about the other pandemic of obesity, heart disease, and diabetes, and people now in America dying earlier than the parent generation.
Yep.
We're talking about a deadly pandemic. And what do we see? We see that it's changing that and having some voice, societal democratic voice, to limit the advertising targeting babies with high fructose corn syrup and trans fats and things that we know to be absolutely toxic. That would be relatively easy to regulate that, to deal with it, but we will only have the political will once people wake up to it, and my big hope is that the social and environmental activists, those who are concerned with climate change, with toxic pollution, and those concerned with poverty and epidemics of depression, etc., that they will come together in a clear, unified voice to focus on the need for an economic shift, which is a major political demand that governments sit down around the same tables where they're now signing trade treaties, giving corporations and banks more power. Now they're coming back with civic society at the table to demand that we start regulating those banks and corporations. It doesn't mean that these companies have to shut down overnight. It simply means they're going to be less profit next year, but they're going to be moving in the direction of, just like musical chairs, they can no longer play that game. They're going to have to be American if they are supposed to be American. They cannot have the freedom to be anywhere and everywhere. And the governments will be regulating and having an umbrella of protection so that instead of a WTO, a World Trade Organization, we have a World Environment and Health Organization that is genuinely keeping an eye in our interests. But the watchdogs will also be empowered to go all the way down to the local level, to empower people to have a say in the choices. Can I just say one more thing? I feel like
absolutely.
One more thing that's been so clear to me going way back to earlier societies is that with the era of so-called cheap oil, the entire economic system was distorted to pretend that using more and more oil to replace people on the land to start with big machines and all the chemicals, the pesticides, the fungicides, herbicides, they're all replacing human labor. When you start from a baseline of colonialism and slavery, that technology looks like a big improvement. But when you start from a baseline of smaller, diversified farms that are feeding their region and their community, you have a completely different picture. And we are now seeing with the new localization movement, we now have a worldwide local food movement, including in Australia, where I helped to start a lot of things back already in 99, 2000, because we didn't really have new farmers markets that were there for farmers to feed their region or to feed their city and their region. But now we're demonstrating with farmers markets, community supported agriculture, a whole range of structures, what happens when you shorten the distance between the farm and the table. And that's one of the central parts of localization. We can produce far more per unit of land, per unit of water, far more. So we can decrease the human ecological footprint by supporting a shift towards localized, diversified food system. If subsidies were shifted overnight, we would see enormous benefits. People don't know that every day countries are routinely importing and exporting the same food product. You have oranges from California selling in Australia at a time when there are Australian oranges available, and in the supermarket, the Californian ones are cheaper. It's a completely artificial price based on pretending that oil was cheap, which it never was. It's false accounting. If we shifted that to support job-rich, ecological, slower, happier ways of doing things, and that's particularly true in the caring industries, whether it's looking after children or the elderly or ourselves, we need people, not robots. Can I also just add one more thing?
Helena, you can add whatever you like. This is your time. Go.
I'm not giving you much of a chance, but have you heard what's happening in Germany recently?
No, go on. Tell us about Germany.
Because right now in Germany, the whole country is being brought to a standstill. I mean, cities all over the country by farmers, starting with farmers. And the immediate was the sort of impulse was that the government was removing subsidies for diesel to farmers. But wonderfully, it's much more than that. So people are now also, by the hundreds of thousands, millions, demonstrating about the increasing poverty, and they're articulating that we need to shift our agricultural subsidies away from the diesel, but to support farmers to produce healthy, diversified, ecological food. To just withdraw and have, millions of farmers lose their livelihood is not our only choice. We can literally right now shift subsidies wherever we are in Australia and Germany, but it's going to take a strong movement and a voice. We need to get the truth out there. But I feel things are shifting, and yeah.
Well, you talk about subsidies. I know that a few years back I read an IMF report which outlined that the fossil fuel industry globally receives $5 trillion a year in subsidies, which equates to $10 million a minute. And we've been talking, I don't know, for 20, 30 minutes. So there's $300 million. And I'm sure there are quite a few farmers globally that could do with that last 30 minutes of subsidies, let alone a whole year.
And now, thank goodness, the important thing too was for people to realize that the COPs have been dominated by big business. And it's really only recently that there's now public knowledge that it's big oil that's running the show. And so
Well,
that
when you're talking about COPs, you're talking about the
climate summit,
climate summit, of course.
the climate summit, that they are, they have been framed by corporate interests from the outset. And people haven't yet quite registered that the focus on carbon has come in from corporate think tanks to reduce this issue to a tradable commodity, again, globally traded in the most corrupt, hideous way. And so even the focus on carbon itself is a problem. The focus should be on fossil fuels. It should be on the subsidies for fossil fuels and shifting those subsidies. And then we also need to realize that a lot of the renewable energy that's being imposed in the form of vast windmill farms and vast solar plantations is also not a good thing. It's being pushed as a way of replacing all the energy that's going into the global economy. We so desperately need a proper accounting. What would it take to actually feed, clothe, house people in their societies in a truly ecological and humane way? We would then see that we do not need more and more and more energy every year. The energy is going into this madness of importing and exporting the same product. And not just that, it's going into the, as you know, a model of built-in obsolescence. More and more the technologies are made to not to last. All of that should be absolutely forbidden. Imagine what we could do if we actually recycled and restored even the refrigerators, the cars, if the materials were reused properly. But that's not happening. It can, and I think it will. I do think inevitably things will change for the better. But the question is how much more crisis we're going to have to witness. Because ultimately, the way that governments are subsidizing the global empire has now turned into subsidies for a system that is primarily a marriage between high tech and the financial casino market that is criminally destructive, linked to the war machine. War is hugely profitable. And we're seeing also that the war in the social media that's destroying the identities of young people is also profitable. So I hope people have seen the film, The Social Dilemma, where the pundits from Silicon Valley are warning us about allowing this to go uncontrolled, unregulated, and continue escalating.
Well, I think it's not only the subsidies, but it's also the fact that the costs, the health and environmental costs and liabilities are never factored into the cost of a product. That's for the community to bear.
Yeah, exactly. That's for the community and the local government to clean up the mess.
Yes.
But
listen, let's strike a more positive note, because I know in October 2023, you attended a summit of Planet Local Summit. Tell us a little bit about that. It was a wonderful event. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I didn't just attend it. My organization organized it, and we started a year early. So we had been organizing conferences around the world before that. And then in the pandemic, we had to cancel. We already had 5 planned in Brazil, Japan. We've been doing them around the world since our film, The Economics of Happiness, was released in 2011. And this year we thought, well, we don't know with the way things are going. We may not be able to do it again. Let's try to do a really big global event. And we were able to collaborate with the former mayor of Bristol, a medium-sized 600,000 people city in the UK. And he had already started doing some great things there, partly through our influence too. There is a very strong, well, mainly through our influence, actually. We started it, a local food movement in Bristol. And what was wonderful was the minute we announced that we were doing this Planet Local Summit, we got such enthusiasm from people who wanted to speak, but also people who were buying tickets. from Brazil, from America, from Japan, from Australia, just to come and listen. And so it was just a remarkable meeting of people who I would say, in the end, when I just looked at the photos after, because I was so in a haze during the actual summit, the whole thing was essentially 5 days, which included 3 days of a public conference with an audience of, the audience was about 1,200, but we had 130 speakers in just 3 days.
Wow.
And so it was quite an organizational thing. Then we had networking days, and then we had other days for just the speakers to connect and collaborate. So it was a major thing. But looking at the photos afterwards is when I became aware of how incredibly beautiful and healthy and inspiring the audience was, as well as the speakers. And they loved each other. There was such a, I kept saying it feels like I organized weddings all at once, hundreds of weddings, because people were just glued together, so thrilled to meet each other from Romania, from Brazil, from Finland. So it basically confirmed what I do feel every day, that at the grassroots, not in the media, not in academia, and some of these people are in academia, but they don't get big grants, they're not heard, we don't hear about them in the media, and it's very hard to find them in social media. But there is this groundswell, and there always has been more localized ways of doing things. So there's still billions of people in the so-called third world who are still building a foundation of local economies that are much healthier. Among other things, they're intergenerational. There's much more contact between the young and the old. One of the key things too is they have much more time for each other, time to sing and dance and cook and celebrate together. And they are also producing much more of what they need, whether it's the food, building the houses. They actually engage in creative, productive work where they see the impact of what they do, where they see the benefit and they know the people who meet them. So there's already, billions of people in the third world, but in some ways, the most inspiring is that in the Western world, there are so many people who want to come back to it, and also millions of people who are succeeding in doing that. It's harder because all the economic pressures are in the opposite direction, psychological pressures in the opposite direction. By the way, in the third world, so-called as well, the psychological pressures are also enormous negative weights because they, through the media, tell people that if you live with your grandparents or if you live closer to the land, if you ever have your hands in the soil, you're backward and primitive. You've got to do everything you can to give your children a good education so they can go to the city. So this is, again, in the movement that gathered in Bristol, we had this very sophisticated group of people who were doing both. They were engaged in the path towards nature, towards community, towards more intergenerational contact, towards the more caring, compassionate, deeply ecological and joyous culture. They were aware of inner health through a spiritual reconnection, the inner reconnection between our brain, our heart, and our gut. The whole path of localization is a path of reconnection. And it doesn't start necessarily with the spiritual, but it either starts with it or it arrives at it because it's part of that cycle of being connected. That's how we evolved. We have to go back to that. We are connected to the soil. We're hearing more and more about the bugs in the ground and the bugs in our gut. We're seeing more and more evidence through neuroscience of the joy even that comes from singing together. What happens to our hormones in our brains when we use our bodies, when we walk. All of this is coming back to being more connected to our bodies, to the earth, and to others. The reconnection to others in many ways is the most difficult, because we've been trained to believe that we shouldn't need anybody else. Needing others is weak. We hear a lot about codependence. A lot of that is rubbish. A lot of people who are codependent are healthily interdependent. And we have to be really aware that all the profound teachings from the ages have been teachings of the interdependence of all of life, the oneness of all of life. And we've been pushed into a mechanistic path that taught us that no, those connections are not real. We can control, we can live separate from each other, separate from nature. And we were, in most cases, manipulated into that. So this is another thing that we're trying to share, is don't internalize that as something that you created, nor blame, Bill Gates for having created this system. He's been pretty clever at creating very lucrative ways of benefiting from a system that has allowed this madness. But we all have to take responsibility, but we also should reduce self-blame and just try to understand what's been happening and wake up to the amazing benefits of a systemic paradigm shift towards seeing that the global versus local is a key element. Key element is disconnection versus reconnection. Key element is away from nature towards nature. Key element is speedy competition versus slowing down and collaboration. Key element is patriarchal, hypermasculine, and a balance between feminine and masculine, and valuing the feminine, which archetypically is the more nurturing, caring, more deeply connected to nature and to others. So we're really thrilled about how the summit went, and we're very grateful. Well, I'm very grateful for having had my eyes open to this from Ladakh, or Little Tibet, and also from Bhutan.
I know we talked about that at our last time, and it's such an inspiring story, though, what you're saying. It's interesting about compassion. We did a whole program on compassion and the power of it, but the importance of self-compassion as a starting point. And it's interesting also about connection, because the irony of our current situation is that we could have thousands of friends, supposedly, on the internet, and yet we don't even connect with the person sitting right next to us. And I think the research shows that loneliness is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day on our health. So it's a big one.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, I also just want to say that I do, because we're such strong advocates of face-to-face personal connection, and really trying to urge people to understand the benefits of that. And it requires that we move away from the terrible pressure we've been under to appear perfect. So we've been isolated into our little nuclear families and behind these very thick walls, where it's the only place where we feel that people know that we're not perfect. When we go out, we're supposed to be perfect. And breaking that down through coming together in circles of support with people who are mature enough to really share journeys, bit modeled on the 12-step program, where people can see that they're not the only ones who have these problems of depression or aggression inside the home, or fear of the future, whatever it might be. The beautiful thing of the 12-step program was that it's through sharing the journey, coming together in community, that the healing happens much more rapidly. And in our localization movement, we're saying that a cornerstone of this is that conscious reconnection with others, which can be a bit frightening, but taking steps in that direction, even just with one like-minded friend can be a very good start. And when you accompany that with a spiritual reconnection to nature, we're also seeing these remarkable examples of prisoners, torture victims, depressed people healing through the reconnection in community and to the animals, to the plant. The animals, just the reconnection, as you probably know, in certain therapies, to dogs or to horses. But broadly speaking, it's to life. And so I think I can't in any way overestimate the benefits of that face-to-face connection. But I'm often told, and I myself am also nourished by my connections to people on the other side of the world. And that's partly what we had in the Planet Local Summit, that like-minded people came together and saw, it's not just in our region, it's not just in our country. And meeting those like-minded people is also very nourishing. And we can make use, as you and I are doing now, of these modern technologies to do that as well. But we've got to be really careful that in the process we're not replacing or preventing that face-to-face lived connection from happening.
Well, I know on a personal level, I was up in Byron recently and I just didn't have enough time to come and visit you, but I will next time for sure. Listen, the summit, Planet Local Summit is one thing, and congratulations, what an amazing achievement and event. I can imagine it being like organizing, weddings. But the World Localization Day is an annual event now.
Yeah, so World Localization Day we set up for June 21st because in the Northern Hemisphere it's the perfect time to be out celebrating in nature. And we started with an online program during COVID. And then we've had people all over the world celebrating the day, sometimes just organizing a local food feast with friends, sometimes putting on a small conference, sometimes a webinar online. So that is definitely continuing. We're putting out the word to our network, and there will be people all over the world celebrating the day. And now it's not always easy for people to do it right on the day. So we actually have things going on for more than a month. But right now, the first thing is May 25th in Japan, and then probably we'll have things going on into July. So please come to our website, worldlocalizationday.org, and even more importantly, come to localfutures.org to see what we're up to. We're a very small organization, but we do have a very wide reach with a lot of our materials translated into more than 40 languages, up to about 50 now. So very small, but very global, and with a broad, holistic view that includes everything from inner well-being to planetary well-being. I hope you'll want to listen to the series we're just starting to put out of video interviews and podcasts from the speakers at our Planet Local Summit. So please do come and check us out.
Well, Helena, thank you so much for everything that you do and you have done. And it's such a pleasure to reconnect with you. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you so much. It was such an inspiration for me. It's just wonderful that you have linked, the physical well-being in this holistic way. I'm so grateful for what you know about dentistry, but from that, to understand that it's about overall health of the individual, but overall health of the planet. So I really thank you for being such a soulmate and such an important voice in Australia.
Thank you. Well, I'd encourage you on a local level to go and visit your local farmers markets and connect with farmers. I said in my book that the 20th century was the year of the revered economist, or the century of the revered economist. And look where that got us. I hope the 21st century will turn out to be the century of the revered farmer, because farmers are who provide us with food and nurture our land. And we need to be connecting with them on a local basis, on a local level, and connecting with the rest of our community in many different ways. Look, we will have links to the Local Futures website and worldlocalizationday.org as well, two sites that I encourage you to visit and support. I also encourage you to join our Unstress Health community, a community where many of our episodes are curated and grouped and edited to pick out the highlights for you. There's a coaching lab podcast as well, where we explore some of the clinical hints that many of our guests have given over the many years of our podcast, live webinars, many resources and many links to organisations that we support in our podcasting. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.